Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Future of XYZ. Excited to introduce our guest today, Sam Livingstone. Sam, thank you for joining us for Future of XYZ on the future of car design.
Thank you, Lisa. Nice to be here with you.
Well, I'm really excited that we're doing this. You're a car and mobility expert, specifically in design. You are the principal and director at Car Design Research, based in Cambridge in the UK and England. You founded that in 2000. You teach, I believe, at the Royal College of Art in the UK, as well as lecture at places like Art Center Pasadena, which has an amazing car design program, as well as Umeå in Sweden and in South Korea. But you also are an IF Design Award Juror in transportation and cars. Alongside this year in Hamburg, we had Albert Kissinger and of Volkswagen and Peter Schreier, formerly of Volkswagen and now of Kia. And we started talking about cars and totally geeking out on cars, which I have a love for as well. And this is how we got here. So I'm thrilled we get to do this interview.
Yeah, no, well, nice to have had that conversation with you and to share a little bit of car love when we were in Germany. So that was good.
My mom used to make fun of me all the time. I think I shared this with you. My mom would be like, why are you such a snob? Like, she really, starting young age, she really hated the fact that I pointed out cars. And it's only been in my adult life that I've come to realize how much I've always loved car design and still have real heart for what's happening, especially on the vintage side, but not exclusively. Yeah. And I think it's important. It behooves us to have this conversation, because we played with what are we talking about? Are we just talking about cars? Are we talking about mobility? Are we talking about vehicles? But I think in the end, we got to this place where it's like the future of car design, Sam. I want to use this time to always introduce, based on your expertise and in the context of today's conversation, define car design for us.
Yeah, I'll try and do it succinctly. I think when we think of design in most industry spaces, be that fashion or product or even interior, it is relatively tightly bound. The designer themselves, the practitioner, will actually be able to touch many facets of what that is. In car design, it could be $1 billion to develop the entire car. There are hundreds, invariably thousands of people who, if you like, design that car in terms of actually get it from an idea to being something you can buy. So the actual design label within automotive is more specific. It is more about the aesthetic. It is less about the wider idea of the vehicle. It's certainly less about the technology or the materiality of it. So in automotive, car design tends to be a slightly narrower band, but you could argue it's also one which has got a bit more fidelity, a little bit more sort of nuance or subtlety. So yeah, I think that's the key distinction sort of takeaway. A car designer, they don't necessarily do less, but they have a less broad remit than designers within other realms.
That's interesting. Do you think that's partially because cars are just so complex?
I think it's almost entirely that, Lisa. You've also got sort of a kissing cousin of that is the way in which the industry is so developed and has been sort of progressed over about 100 years since the first car designer was out there. So that it's now, in terms of process and, if you like, roles and responsibilities, really quite tightly defined. You've even also got different types of car designer fundamentally, and if you like, simply, you've got exterior designers, interior designers, but also a body of designers called color material finish designers that tend to do the stuff that you can literally see and touch and enjoy inside the vehicle. And of course, a growing band of people who would be called UI designers. So even in automotive design, you've got several distinctly different design types.
It makes sense. At Car Design Research, the firm that you run, you all claim to be fluent in car design, to see things from a customer point of view, but also to embrace the connected, autonomous, shared, and electrified future. I'm curious what you think the state of car design is today.
Yeah, I mean, I had some idea you might ask me that question, and it's a pretty big, sweeping question. So I'll do my level best to sort of somehow answer. The state of car design, I suppose, simply in one word, would be anxious. Within the car design space, it's a sort of a lens, if you like, for the wider industry, which is kind of under duress. It's flipping from internal combustion engines for petrol and diesel powered vehicles to electric ones. There's all sorts of machinations, but the headline there is an economic one. It's really tricky to make these things at a price point in which people are going to easily swallow. But there's a variety of other things which are just fundamentally about how an industry is changing in the heart of what it actually delivers. But then parallel and separate to that is the sort of emergence of China, both as a consumer of cars and a producer of cars, the related point in which they can make these vehicles so cheaply. And then I guess you've got wider geopolitical things at bay. So there's actually a whole load of stress and strain on what is essentially massive organizations that straddle many different regions and are, yeah, inherently unable to be as agile as perhaps most other sectors might be. It's a really interesting challenge, but one that's so exciting because of that change, I suppose.
Well, I mean, you touched on a bunch of different things in there, Sam, that I want to pull on the threads. I think one is the difference between different regulatory markets as well as consumer demand regions. I mean, how do car companies account for all of that? I mean, what is it? What is the model and design? You can't make different designs. Well, I mean, you can have small releases. I mean, I know Volkswagen has, for instance, the GTI in the US and the Golf still in Europe. And that's a tiny little example. There are market specific designs, but there are regulatory conditions also that need to met. How do car designers account for those differences in today's world and looking towards the future?
I mean, there have always been some degree of those regulatory differences in different markets. Simplistically, you've got Asia, you've got Europe, you've got America, but even then, you've got some divisions that sit in there, and they sit around emissions and stuff, which is, if you like, on the technical side. So, not something that most designers are able to affect or have bearing on. But then you've got other things which would be more pertinent, like, so for example, in Europe, we have a thing called pedestrian impact legislation, which means if a car drives into you, it shouldn't cut you into 1,000 small pieces, which maybe a Cybertruck might do, which is certainly why you can't buy one of those in Europe. So there is sort of instances where regulatory requirements prevent a vehicle from being sold in one country or other, but many countries, of course, or sorry, many car brands are developing vehicles which conform to those in most or all of those sectors. And some of them, of course, choose just to focus on their home territory. So many Chinese designs are only designed for that market. I mean, there is distinctions there, Lisa, and it is a factor for design, but it's probably one of the less large or chunky or if, dare I say it, most interesting ones. I think the difference is when you look across an international thing is the nature of how people are different and also how they're so similar. And the ways in which they're the ways in which they flex their muscles with their wallet to affect the nature of what a car design could or should be. And I think that's the most interesting thing because the rate of change is so fast. And yeah, it's just fascinating to see the subtle distinctions between different regions in what they want and their appetite for different vehicles.
So it's a great answer and so interesting because every industry has its versions of this, but cars, for this answer that you gave on what is car design, I think this is like quite an interesting challenge. But something that may be juicier, meatier, more interesting than that is, of course, the role of brand, which, of course, is my favorite topic. I mean, you have so many car companies now with the EVs in China and all the rest of it. I mean, you guys at Car Design Research work with Toyota and Bentley and Polestar and Hyundai and Ford and Honda and Volkswagen Group and McLaren and Kia, and I don't even know where it stops. Volvo, MG. Like you guys have this very broad portfolio, and that doesn't even begin to kind of touch the tip of the iceberg in terms of car companies and brands that are out there. What is the role of brand in design? Like, let's talk about it. Like differentiation, customer loyalty, preference. I don't even know. Like,
Yeah.
there's so much happening on that space. It feels.
There really is. And so it's very hard to have a sort of short conversation with you about that, I suppose. I think in design, there's a lack of appreciation for just how significant brand is. Obviously, designers recognize that they are designing a vehicle which needs to imbue and express the character which is consistent with or derives from that brand. So, you know, we can all think as we listen to you and I talk now of a particular car brand. Maybe it's one we own or we particularly love. And when we think of that, there's all sorts of associations of meaning that we have, which we've got from that company's communications and that are embedded in our head. But a lot of it also comes from the nature of what those vehicles are and fundamentally from their design. You know, you see a Bentley on the street and it speaks of being a Bentley. Or at least it should do, or it'll certainly have a bearing on how you receive it. You know, when you see it, if you're like, no, you know what, that doesn't look like a Bentley should do. So design is such a communication tool. And in automotive design, this three-dimensionality and the way in which we've got proportions, we've got scale, we've got the type of design, we've got the surfaces, we've got the details, we've got the graphic, so many facets of automotive design have this purpose of communicating meaning. And a lot of the work that we do is about establishing, okay, what is the meaning that that brand should have, but also then what is the meaning that that model within that brand should have that's distinct to the core? And then how should that be communicated, made evident, and sort of delivered and realized in a positive way that it should be through design. So design three-dimensionally, automotive, exterior predominantly, but also the interior to communicate. It's such a massive thing. And I'm always a little bit frustrated why in the way that which it may often be presumed to be communicated essentially through communications and sort of 2D, if you like, advertising and PR and so forth, when actually the product itself, in its visual, but also how it feels and all sorts of other facets of your consumption of design really is the core of the communicator of the brand. But there's all sorts of other ways, of course. I don't know, I shouldn't just rabbit on. I should hear what you should ask of me. But I'm also mindful of how much important it is as a signifier of brand. So we're familiar with the sort of logo marks and how they signify brand. But as you've alluded to, there's so many new brands out there. Increasingly, when you're competing in certain regions, particularly China, where you've got a fairly young audience, shall we say, they're not accustomed to vehicles and they don't navigate brands with the long period of heritage that we have most in the West. So the need to assert yourself and your brand through the three-dimensionality as well as the logos, and to do that in a way that's both distinct but also consistent, and to understand the values of consistency and distinction. I don't know, that's another realm. But
well, I mean, as a brand person, like all of that makes perfect sense. And to many of our listeners, they who aren't brand people, they probably will intuit what you're saying. But I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting, I mean, just to use an example that went viral and then kind of fell off a cliff, it seems to me, is the Jaguar, also known as Jaguar, rebrand, relaunch that happened in December at Art Basel, Miami. And kind of there was question in this sphere is like, is this a spoof? Is this a like, what is this? I have no idea what happened with the design of cars, but the idea was that it was going younger and taking back the Jaguar heritage. But that's one example. The Volkswagen, like, re-release of what we called in Southern California growing up, like the van again, the classic, van. I mean, these are design pieces that are really putting the brand first and foremost, and putting the brand on the line in some ways. I mean, design really is actually, like, as you said, it's not only a communication tool, but it's kind of like the manifestation.
yes, totally. I totally agree. I'm not sure if there's a question there, but I will still respond, which is it's hard and tricky to talk about the Jaguar thing, just because, I don't know, I struggle with what they have done, and I feel like there's some marked missed opportunities there, which seem to me to be writ large, and something sad, I suppose, also about what I would feel quite confident is a misstep. But anyway, that's maybe just pushing things a little bit further than I would suppose I need to. But you're talking also, I think, about the sort of the way in which Jaguar, to an extent, but certainly in the instance of Volkswagen, are sort of using their heritage to convey a story and a meaning which is rich and deep and goes back over time and reasserts itself in a contemporary manner. And I think there's something very powerful about it. Of course, it won't work in all instances for all brands, not least those without a back catalogue that they can usefully do that from. But we're seeing much more evidence of mainstream brands recognizing the equity of things they had in the past and there's a story that they can use in that to bring it forward to a modern context. It's a challenge, of course, to keep doing so. How many times can you do that? There's also a question mark over the degree to which everybody has appetite for something which has, if you like, a lot of its equity in the past. It sort of almost frames it as not necessarily as somehow contradicting the idea of being immediately relevant for today. But I think there's many instances of brands that have not yet and yet could and should perhaps go forwards to use the equity of their past, not just by regurgitating it, but also in a way to present themselves as more than something of the moment, but to present themselves as having such a breadth that they're not just a Polaroid snap or an Instagram snap, stationary little snapshot, if you like, of time, but that actually they're almost like a film. They have a richness and a depth because of this story and the meaning that goes beyond there. So, I mean, I think maybe you and I are riffing off each other a bit here as petrol heads or gear heads, maybe. But yeah, for sure, there's a real equity there. And it's something we are seeing more and more of. There's a lot of instances of new designs which are in different ways leveraging aspects of heritage and or of storification that they have from their brands. So fascinating space.
It's a totally fascinating space. And there are lots of places we can go, but I kind of want to like move us towards the future. But one of the things that, you said at the outset, car design is really kind of the envelope and the materiality and finishes of kind of the consumer experience of it, not the tech. But there is this kind of dynamic in car design specifically, which is it's very technical, but it's also sophisticated and very emotional as well. I mean, how in car design, like what are some of the unique challenges, I guess, in balancing these seemingly competing and complex parameters?
Yeah, again, I mean, I'm sure at some point you'll ask me an easy question. That one is right up there because
I doubt it, Sam.
I mean, there is something fascinating for me as an individual, which is why I guess I love my job, which is that you've got possibly the world's most complex, technically sort of consumer durable. You think of just the sheer number of bits, if you like, that have to go into a car. Clearly, that walks over any other artifact that one actually spends money on. So on one side, clearly you have that, if you like, technical, tangible complexity. But yeah, as you're alluding to as well, you've also got this incredible emotive, layered set of meanings and symbols and status. And for the most part, most people who own a vehicle do actually own something which is more than it needs to be because of that reason. And they will claim perhaps not to, but I don't think it normally takes too long to dissuade people that that's necessarily the case. The way in which people, even if they don't choose to have a very high status item, will certainly choose to not have a low status car, shall we say. So the whole symbolism that the vehicle has, as if you like the world's most sophisticated consumer durable, and the way in which it sort of evidences more about who people are in a more sort of complete manner, perhaps, than many other things. Maybe there's people that would suggest that architecture or what we wear does that, but I'd happily have an argument with them, because I think there's so many facets as to what constitutes a vehicle and a modern car design that do that in a more evolved manner than any other discipline. And so much of that, of course, is just due to the dollars that are being spent on this craft, this space. The amount of money that goes into conceiving a single piece of machinery that we see parked on the side of the road. It's unparalleled. You've got just millions of dollars invested in talent to make that how it is. So the density of talent and that's been remunerated, if you like, to conceive these things there's no parallel. So it's a fascinating thing to consume in that respect.
I mean, I have so many things I could say, but I want to ask quickly, as we start moving, like from the emotive to the technical. I mean, there is this argument now that, like, our cars are just big computers. And so that you mentioned about UI design, like UI, UX, this kind of user interface, user experience, the apps. Like, every car now has a computer in it. And frankly, I went from an older car to a newer car, and I have to say, like, I liked my older car from a car perspective. I appreciate the technical aspects of this UI, but it's very frustrating. Like, as we're going from today into the future, like, what is that evolving role of, let's call it, digital or technology in car design, and how do you account for it?
Yeah, well, you and I could have a separate conversation about the frustrations of modern in-car tech, but there's two core things, I guess, to sort of respond to your point. That if you think of the auspices of the car, it was kind of like a horseless carriage. I mean, that's literally what they were called. And I think a lot of the semantics and meaning and idea of a car actually stems from, if you like, the idea of the horse and the idea of riding a horse and the sort of associations thereof. And then on the other side, of course, you've perhaps, shall we say, got a modern contemporary smartphone. And broadly, the car sits somewhere on that spectrum. And it's fundamentally traveling from the horse to the phone. And right now, particularly with electric powertrains, but also the things you're alluding to within the vehicle, it's getting much, much closer to the smartphone. And I would put it to you that if you jumped into a car in Shanghai, you'd go another level further than the vehicle that you're used to in the States. So there is that sort of migration in what the car actually is as a technical artifact. But along with that, and I think this is one of the most interesting design challenges, is the way in which that's shifting the identity of the car. So the actual nature of how we should see and understand a vehicle. And briefly, to sort of touch on Jaguar again, Jaguar, if you like, as a sort of automotive form, and to an extent some of the other classic brands like Alfa Romeo, they, if you like, speak to more of the horse, the sports car, the idiom of the romantic idea of a dynamic vehicle traveling through space, than they do to the sort of technical element that can enable you to have an amazing experience within the vehicle. So there's a challenge there. There's also connects to brand in this movement as to the nature and the identity of what a car is and how that's moved. But just to sort of the second element of my answer to your question is about how it's used as well, and the way that these things at the minute may make our journeys easier or better, and occasionally, of course, frustrate us with how we're not able to make something happen. But increasingly, the vehicle will be used more when it's stationary. Not exclusively. There'd be no point in just buying a vehicle and parking it up. But actually, the value that we get when they're stationary, if it's electric, it'd be strange to sit there for a long time in your vehicle with an engine running, just looking at the view in a nice spot. But if it's electric, that stops being strange. So the way in which the electric vehicle unlocks the use of the vehicle as a third space after the home, after the office, really is an interesting one. It's not going to become the central reason that the car is used, but it unlocks a totally new use scenario. And then, of course, the UI, the delivery of UX within the vehicle is a new chapter, which is quite different to the one that maybe you're experiencing as you're driving along, trying to, make something happen that's not immediately apparent whilst looking at the road at the same time. So really interesting shift in the nature of what it is, but also how it will be used, I think.
It's fascinating. I mean, and you've actually 3 questions kind of that we're following, and I'm watching time. So you've nicely, Sam, kind of consolidated into one, which is definitely going to be too big a question, but I'm going to try. You touched on a couple of things. You touched on like electric vehicles. And obviously, as we move more into EVs and away from combustion engines, as well as into hybrids, there are a lot of opportunities I would imagine are opening on the design side. I mean, I just read an article yesterday about Ferrari's like, redesigned V12, which is oval shaped, which then can sit nicely next to a battery for a hybrid Ferrari at some point in the future. I don't know. It was a press release from Ferrari. But I think about that from a design side. Again, car designers don't design the engine in this context of this conversation, but you got to fit the engine into the box, and then the UI and all the rest of it. But obviously, there are other opportunities being opened by like autonomous and semi-autonomous vehicles. You think about like the driverless trucks, like long haul trucks and things. Like, is a car going to be a car? And you talk about third spaces and things like, is a car going to be a car? Is a truck going to be a truck? Is a scooter going to be a scooter? A motorcycle? Or like, as we move into the future, is electrification and autonomous vehicles opening the way to something completely different than what we currently understand car design to be?
Okay, so the questions will get harder, I think is what you're saying. So that's you have covered a huge bandwidth. I think that when we're looking at what the future is going to be, so many of us have sort of got some sense of the sort of sci-fi portrayal of it. And autonomous cars, of course, have been the science fiction for 50, 60, even 70 years. And our shortcut of that is that we're on a highway going at some speed and we're all playing Scrabble or something. My understanding of autonomous travel, and I'm no technical expert on this, so I need to sort of qualify it with that to some degree, is that actually this idea has almost confused expectations and what people are seeking to accomplish with autonomous. Because autonomous travel has existed ever since the taxi was invented. You're not driving that vehicle, and we think how a taxi is different to our normal car, and well, it kind of isn't different really at all. So autonomous actually in many respects is quite a mundane thing, unless we look at the fact that the taxi driver has to be charging a lot of money. And actually an autonomous vehicle, the distinction with a taxi is that it's cheaper per distance. It's not necessarily cheaper to buy, but in terms of usage per minute, it's ostensibly much cheaper. So what that really means is unlocking use scenarios where it's being used at low speed, and clearly autonomous technologies work in a way at low speed that they just cannot and don't reliably at high speed. So my view is that it's actually more on the mundane fringes in the immediate and future scenario for autonomous, where you rock up at your destination, you can't find a parking space, but you just abandon the car and let it just very slowly sort itself out. So you've got sort of small stuff like that, which actually won't rock everybody's lives. But when they come in, you'll be like, oh, well, that's good to have. I don't want to have a vehicle without that in the future. But it's not going to actually blow your mind, and you won't be playing Scrabble at 80 miles an hour on the motorway. So I think autonomous is a bit of a misnomer in some respects. We worked on a program with Volvo. We did the 360C concept and its idea. We didn't design them. They did that. And that was an idea which was to, instead of taking short-haul flights, which are obviously environmentally the worst form of flight you can do, you get into a vehicle at bedtime, you go to sleep, it would drive very slowly through the night when streets are not busy, when electricity is readily available, and it would get you to your destination. So the coupling of the technology to a use scenario, I feel like, is the sort of richest driver of design innovation, and that might be a moderately good example of how that could be.
I love that as an example. And it brings us back to this third space concept. I mean, we're going to use the Volkswagen van again, this Californian that they're calling it, which has this pop tent and all the rest of it. But there is some kind of interesting socio-cultural, post-pandemic perhaps, trend that the love of the outdoors, the desire to be with family, like what's happening in this space for cars, and is this going to stick, or is this like a moment?
I think it's a really interesting one, Lita, and it's kind of fascinating for me to hear you speak it back to me. It's something we've been holding up to clients for 3 or 4 years. These days, if you're out on the streets, you'll see people running. If you were out in the streets 50, 60 years ago, somebody was running on the street, that's an odd sight. Fundamentally, as people, we're spending much more time outdoors and doing relatively active pursuits. Cycling's taking off everywhere. And these sort of groundswell of social cultural trends, not just in the States or Europe, it's also in China. They're perhaps younger on this outdoor active, certainly countryside bandwagon, but they're jumping at it quite hard. And we're seeing evidence of, we all know the world is being taken over by the crossover and the SUV. And it's not, and one of the reasons, and there's several, But one of the reasons of that is that the image it portrays is that we are people who engage in outdoor active pursuits to some degree, that we have an affiliation for the countryside, maybe the weekends. And that as an identity is more appealing than the sort of large, I know, business executive sedan, which you'd associate with the city, perhaps, which is maybe what the status symbol would have been 20, 30 years ago. So you've actually got an automotive design trend which aligns with what you're talking about. I think this is going to extend. You asked about third place. I think there's so many opportunities as well for, instead of the vehicle just taking you to the countryside and taking your canoes or your mountain bikes there, then you get out of the vehicle and you do your thing. I think third space in the context you're talking about means the vehicle gets to its destination and then becomes part of that experience, that it's, it's the base that you sleep in, possibly, certainly the point that you sort of rest and recuperate to some degree, you get changed. It's a place to share. It's a place, if you're in the UK, to stay out of the rain. Do you know what I mean? So I think that the opportunity for vehicles to play a slightly greater role in that trend space you're identifying is really marked. And I would gently suggest that not many brands are really running towards that in the way that they could do. There's some real opportunities there that we're seeing quite a lot of people not fully recognizing. It's perhaps because it's not quite as grand as the extreme sports side and the sort of extremely macho off-road side that sort of, if you like, is the center of the identity of these brands. But it's really important. And I think it's really a good one that you held up.
It's fascinating to me because there's so much there. And I mean, you think about the rugged, the rugged like Jeep, for instance, or Range Rover or Land Cruiser, any of these kinds of like hardcore, outdoor vehicles. And you see the rise of the SUV even in Europe, which of course, if they're not electric, they're using a lot more gas. And if they are electric, they're using a lot more electricity because they're bigger and bolder. So that the hypocrisy in some ways of all of us, like, buying these SUVs that are in fact destroying the nature that we claim to enjoy in them. But that's a conversation for a different day. As we kind of come up on time, the one thing we haven't had a chance to touch on yet before I get into our final questions is the role of AI in car design. And I'm curious, and maybe it's in car design because of UI, or maybe it's in car design because we're replacing designers, but like, how do you see AI coming into car design, and where do you think it's going to be going?
Yeah, I mean, you've almost alluded to the two answers there, Lisa, which is helpful. Perhaps it's both within the design process. It is there really very much as an augmentative tool. It's not one, I think people have used the sort of flippant expression of that car was designed by a computer, which I think everybody listening to this podcast will know is not the case. The design community knows that these are tools. And I think, the informed world out there knows that too. But there is this expression, has that been designed by a computer? And maybe that expression is about to be, has that been designed by AI? And of course, it will play a role, but fundamentally, it's not going to take away the core creative intent. The way we see it being used, and this is not our specialist area of expertise, is, if you like, almost as a filler. In the middle of the conversation, you've got the creative ideas that are coming from designers. To the left and the right, peripherally, you've got some things riffing off that, which will, if you like, give you a bit of filler, give you a few alternatives at a very easy, fundamentally low cost and very quick way to give you a more complete and full picture. So it's helping, but it's not actually in the middle of the conversation with regard to the creation of new things in the automotive design space. But then also you alluded to how it's coming into the car, and yes, it is. We're seeing it a step behind what we're seeing in the best wearables, but it's going to come in simplistically in the form that we've got already used to, serving those people with a modern car, a screen which will have apps on it, very much like your phone, very much like a pad. That's now in the car. What we will increasingly see is a reduction in the way in which we have to access separate apps, because AI will work across the different systems. So it's something we're already seeing in the consumer tech space, and it's coming through into automotive. There is clearly a lot of opportunity to go further, because within a car, back to your brand point, there's the curation of how that's done in a way that's distinct for that vehicle and that brand. And
now, hopefully safer for the driver, because that's part of my beef, right? I mean, that's a big opportunity for safety, it seems, too.
Yes. Should be looking the road.
Ideally so. Sam, as we knew, the geek in me is totally inspired. But we're almost at time, so I'm going to throw out the last two questions. The first of these last two questions is for listeners and viewers who are interested in learning more about car design in general. Are there one or two iconic references that you would point them to?
If you go into a bookshop and you look at the design section, it's not the biggest section. You go into the car section, it's not the biggest section. The car design section doesn't exist. There's no overlap. So it's kind of tricky to just get a book down. There's a website called, well, yeah, you will find them, but they are thin on the ground.
Wow.
You will find online, of course, a thing called Car Design News. A long time ago, that was part of what I did. And that is the default point of entry for most of the community to find something out and or go from there. So that would be the obvious place. Within that empire, which it is now, albeit a small one, is Car Design Review, and that is a dedicated publication. And yeah, that's really strong. It's an annual thing, but there's a little bit more depth. It's a bit more, should we say, broadsheet, to maybe use an English term, than tabloid. So yeah, those would be two places I would hold up.
That's awesome. I love that. And because no one can get a hold of, except for the muckety mucks at these big car companies, can get a hold of your all's car design research trend report, which I got a sneak peek at, which was pretty amazing. Um, Last question. I mean, I think about, your work stems from this future perspective and really through the lens of the customer. And we've talked a lot about brand, but also the technical. There's this piece of like, what will consumers want in 5, 10, 50, 100 years in terms of the car design? But what is your personal greatest hope for, the future of car design in, let's call it 25 years, in 2050?
Yeah, I mean, so the way you phrased it, and I'm not in any position trying to correct or adjust that, but my inference was that car design is reactive to what customers want. And it's my firm view that car design should not always be that it should actually seek to hold something up which makes sense and that people come to it. That, in other words, that's in a position, as I think maybe all disciplines of design are, is to land something which makes sense, which hasn't happened before, which people wouldn't ever have known they wanted because it's literally box fresh. So doing something in that realm is always what gets me out of bed. And I suppose on a sort of slightly moany, whingy level, I would love to work with more clients who are interested in making something that's better, not just different. And I have a gentle nag and a concern that with the speed of development, the sort of reduced profitability of all sorts of things as well, people are really running fast, and it seems to be increasingly about, can we do something quickly? Can we do something different? Less about purpose, less about making things a better, different world. So in a broad brushstroke, what I would like to see, I would love to see, would be some proper step big changes for something which is created, which is clearly an attractive and amazing and aspirational and fun thing, but also that actually makes a difference and which we didn't see coming and would be truly useful. And as a consequence, of course, a real commercial hit. So that's the exciting thing for me in a rather general way, Lisa.
Sam Livingstone, Principal Director at Car Design Research in Cambridge, UK. Thank you so much for this conversation that I can't wait to continue.
Me too, Lisa. Thank you very much. Great to do it with you.
For all of our viewers and listeners, thanks so much for joining us for another episode of Future of XYZ. If you don't already subscribe, be sure to do so, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review for this or other episodes, wherever you get your favorite podcast, because that's how people find us. Thank you. We will see you again in 2 weeks. And Sam, thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Lisa.